The vision of Mother Teresa was to establish an order of nuns who would have their sole purpose to care for those who lived in conditions unworthy sometimes, or that they weren't getting human dignity. So she moved to the streets of Calcutta and established a place there for people who were literally dying on the streets. And she would give them a place to die with dignity and in cleanliness and with honor. Throughout her life, her primary credential was her moral authority. Even when she found herself thrust before a hostile audience, she maintained the courage of her convictions. Now, on February 3rd, 1994, Mother Teresa came to Washington, D.C., and she was the speaker for the annual prayer breakfast. There were 3,000 people there, and many officials. President Clinton and his wife Hillary sat on the stage. Vice President Al Gore and his wife sat on the stage. Supreme Court justices sat on the stage. And many, many, many officials were in that building. The last section of her speech addressed the subject of abortion, even though that was very controversial. She said, and I quote, "But I feel that the greatest destroyer of peace today is abortion. Because Jesus said, if you receive a little child, you receive me." So every abortion is the denial of receiving Jesus, the neglect of receiving Jesus. After an awkward silence and some applause, she continued, "Abortion is really a war against the child, and I hate the killing of innocent children, murder by the mother herself. And if we accept that a mother can kill even her own child, how can we tell other people not to kill one another? Any country that accepts abortion is not teaching its people to love one another, but to use any violence to get what they want. This is why the greatest destroyer of love and peace is abortion." After speaking about the wonderful alternative of giving up an unwanted child for adoption into a loving family, she finished her speech and left through the exit. Now just picture this. She was a short lady, this small, slightly stooped over woman, standing on a box. They put her on a box so people could see her over the podium, addressing some of the most powerful men in the world. She could do that because she had moral authority. And no one there dared raise a finger in opposition. A good leader, in order to lead, needs moral authority. And we want to see that this morning from our study as we continue on through the book of Nehemiah. We want to see how the importance of moral authority, integrity, would be another word we will use. A good leader must have that kind of integrity. Nehemiah 5:14 through 19, and we are going to see, learn about this. I've asked Jonathan to come and read that passage, so if you will follow along as he reads for us Nehemiah 5:14 through 19.
Is this on? Can you guys hear me? There we go. "Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provisions. But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from them bread and wine besides 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. Indeed, I also continued the work on the wall, and we did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for the work. And at my table were 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came to us from the nations around us. Now that which was prepared daily was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also fowl were prepared for me, and once every 10 days an abundance of all kinds of wine. Yet in spite of this, I did not demand the governor's provisions, because the bondage was very heavy on this people. Remember me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people."
We want to see this morning from this passage that a good leader must have moral authority. which comes when people see him demonstrate his convictions in his sacrificial actions. Moral authority, integrity. When people see a person consistent between what he says and what he does, and that he acts upon his convictions. Nehemiah, in the first couple verses, we see how he had the moral authority to learn, to lead the nation of Judah, to accomplish what was right. Now, in last week's section, if you glance back, if you missed it, we see how he confronts the leaders of the nation of Judah now, the nobles, who are taking economic advantage of the poor conditions of the people. And Nehemiah, as a good leader, he knows that you cannot brush that off and let that go. It just, the grumbling may go underground, but it will explode later on. And so he deals head on with the problem and confronts these leaders. And because of the moral authority he has, they back down and say, okay, you're right. This is a disobedience against God's law, and we will give the money back, the interest we've been charging, and so on, and the people back. They had been taking children and wives as slaves, actually. And so we'll straighten it all out. And he makes them take an oath to carry it out, and they do. Nehemiah follows that up in our book of Nehemiah, where he records his story of going to Jerusalem. He follows it up by giving his own philosophy of leadership. Wow, this would be very important in our government today, in our governments around the world, would it not? To have a godly philosophy of leadership. And so Nehemiah, first of all, tells us in verse 14 and 15, he refused to take the governor's normal provisions. Verse 14, moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provisions. But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of the Lord. It was customary and allowed by King Artaxerxes for governors of his empire to exact from the people the food and the money that they needed to run the government, and so on. That was expected. All governors did that. The former governors of Judah had done that. But Nehemiah broke with their ranks. He did not follow that protocol. He knew that the burden upon the people was heavy, and they were poor and they were struggling. There was a famine, we learned last week, and they were not able to pay their taxes, and they were putting up their land as collateral and losing it, and they were actually having to put children into servitude just to get food to eat. And Nehemiah says, no, I'm not going to exact any of the governor's provisions that I can have, food and wine and money and all from them. And so he chose not to do that. Now, he is the governor. We're not sure exactly when he was proclaimed the governor, but at some time during this 12 years, he became the governor, which is the most powerful position underneath the king, Artaxerxes, over the nation of Judah now. And he served as 12 years, but all those 12 years, he did not benefit as a fringe benefit of getting this food and wine and money from the people. The former governors had done that. Even those governors' assistants took advantage of their position to oppress the people. I like the words that are used there. It's interesting for us to look at that. End of verse 15. Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people. Those two words mean to domineer, to rule or exercise power over in a cruel, autocratic way. The abuse of power through extortion. Today we would say corruption. This is a dictator, a despot, someone who is there to get all he can get, bleed out of the people all that he could. Now, of course, last week we saw that even the Jewish leaders were kind of acting that way. And Nehemiah confronts them. One of the things we want to understand with the connection here, you know, you look at last week and you say, okay, so Nehemiah confronts these Jewish leaders, these nobles, who could undermine him, by the way. I mean, okay, so he's appointed by Artaxerxes, but they could complain back to Artaxerxes, and, they could make a lot of trouble for Nehemiah. So to take them on publicly and to have them back down so clearly and say, okay, we'll give it all back, and they did, how is that possible? That's almost too good to be true. I mean, we wish we could walk up to Washington, D.C. today and do that, right? Well, one of the reasons that worked, Nehemiah wants us to know, is that he had the moral authority to demand that. And that's what he's explaining now in this passage, the last part of chapter 5. We see, secondly, in verse 15c at the end, that Nehemiah was motivated by his reverence for God's principles. He says at the end of verse 15, "But I did not do so," I didn't do what the former governors did, because it would win me approval by the people? That's not what it says. Because I wanted my project of building the wall to go better? That's not what it says. Because of the fear of the Lord. Nehemiah has an integrity. He has a respect. He isn't worried about what the nobles think about him, their evaluation, what they're going to put on, what they're going to say about him, what they're going to write back to King Artaxerxes about. He's not worried about that. He's not worried about popularity. He's not worried about what people think of him. Oh, I wish we could get to that point today. We are much too interested in what people think about us. No, Nehemiah is concerned because he has a reverence for God. It's God's evaluation that he is concerned about. And so that's what motivates him. Nehemiah's reverence for God kept him from placing a heartless burden on his fellow Jews. This is further evidence now of his sterling leadership qualities. If you want to be a leader that stands out among others, then you need to have great integrity. And we're not talking just about leading a country or leading a business even. We're talking about leading a home. We're talking about leading a marriage. We're talking about leading a small group at work or at school or whatever. Being the kind of person that's worthy to follow, you need to have integrity so that you have moral authority. We'll talk about that a bit more here later. But Nehemiah has this. He has compassion for those under him, and he refuses to use his privileges at the expense of others. Now, look how pervasive Nehemiah's model is. We find out that even his servants follow that example. Wow, verse 16. "Indeed, I also continued the work on the wall, and we did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for the work." Whether these servants came with him from, Persia, from the Persian capital, or whether he, gained some of the servants there as the governor, I'm sure both were true. But all of his servants are following his example. They are not using extortion and using their power for their own personal benefit. They see that Nehemiah is committed to God's work of building this wall, and so they're all building on the wall. They're all committed along with Nehemiah. So his example within his integrity and moral authority is so powerful that all of his servants follow it, even though they're well aware of the past and what most servants of the governor do. Then we find out that Nehemiah sacrificially helped the people, verses 17 and 18. He says, "And at my table were 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came to us from the nations around us. Now what was prepared daily was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also fowl were prepared for me, and once every 10 days an abundance of all kinds of wine. Yet in spite of this I did not demand the governor's provisions, because the bondage was heavy on this people." So now you got to imagine this food, all right? 1 ox. How long would it take you to eat a whole cow, a whole ox, and 6 sheep, and all the birds, and all of this. Someone has calculated that there's probably food here for over 500 people. He says 150 Jews and then people from other nations. Well, did they have that many dignitaries visiting from other nations surrounding? I don't know. Maybe he gave the food that was left over to the people working on the wall. I don't know, but 500 people he's feeding, not out of the governor's, perks that he could have gotten, but from his own money, from his own account, out of his own pocket. How long? A week? 12 years. Wow. He is sacrificially helping the people. And, I can't help but wonder why he includes every day feeding 150 Jews and rulers. I got to wonder about that. Probably some of the same guys that he stood up and condemned publicly we looked at earlier in the chapter, looked at last week. Probably some of these guys are eating at his table every day. Maybe Nehemiah has a strategy there, right? And of course, that's partly why Nehemiah could say, "How dare you make slaves out of Jewish brothers and sisters and their children when I am buying them back? I am trying to redeem them and set them free, and you're putting them back into slavery." Wow, he could embarrass them because of his generosity and his integrity and his moral authority. Well, how generous are you? I know many of you were generous this week with Zambian brethren. You gave them beds to sleep in, and you gave them food and so on. Many of you are generous in many other ways as we give here every Sunday morning to God's work, as we support missionaries. And you support other missionaries, and maybe you go give time, maybe volunteering at Ashore Women's Center or Open Door Mission or other places, or maybe going to Red Lake Indian Reservation to minister there, or Zambia, or wherever. Ways that we can give and be generous. Certainly, as we saw in Mother Teresa's story, it's her generosity and her love for people and her serving them that gave her that moral authority. And here, Nehemiah as well is able to demonstrate and model a generous giving out of his own account and helping people and to try to teach these rulers a new way to lead. And it gives him the moral authority to demand that they stop taking advantage of these poor Jewish people. Well, why was Nehemiah doing this? In the middle of this, verse 16, we find out that his motives were very, very pure. Verse 16, he says, "Indeed, I also continued the work on the wall. We did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for work." What is the significance, you say, of what he's saying there? Well, number one, the standard practice, of course, like we do today, would be to mortgage your assets if you need to borrow money. These people couldn't pay their taxes. We learned that earlier in chapter 5. They didn't have money for food. They were mortgaging their land. They were losing their land to a lot of these Jewish leaders, but not Nehemiah. See, as governor, he had the most authority, the most power. He could have loaned the most money. He could have mortgaged the most land. And when the people couldn't pay, he could have gotten that land. And he could have resold it and made a big profit. Sounds like a wonderful business strategy, doesn't it? But Nehemiah tells us, "I acquired no land, either by mortgaging it or buying it. I am not here, although I'm here 12 years, I am not here trying to set anything up for me. I am not here to gain anything financially. I'm not here to profit in any way." And so he stays clear of that. He has absolutely no contradiction here in his providing for the people and giving to them and being sacrificial. His motives are pure. Not only did he personally not do that, but none of his assistants were allowed to do that as well. They were not acquiring land either. They were working on the job they were given. That was their focus. He was not afraid to get his hands dirty. He was down there working on the wall. He wasn't sitting in the ivory tower giving commands. He was working on the wall with the people, and so were his servants. And I don't know if all of his servants coming from the capital of Persia expected that's what they were going to do, but that's what they were doing. And Nehemiah had them doing that, and they followed his model, and he did that. Nehemiah never abused his position of governor in any way. He would not jeopardize the people's respect for him. He never lost sight of God's calling in his life. He was in Jerusalem to help people, not exploit them. That wasn't even a possibility in Nehemiah's motivation. Well, there are many, many leaders around the world who claim they're there to help people, but they're really exploiting them. Nehemiah was there to exemplify God's law, to model it, to be a good, pure example of it, not to violate it. Nehemiah was there to rebuild a wall, not to build a personal empire. And everyone could see that his motives were pure because his actions followed what he said. And then look at verse 19, where Nehemiah prays for God to remember him. Verse 19, "Remember me, O God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people." This is not the only time in the book that we'll see Nehemiah pray. We've seen him pray a couple times already, but not the only time in the book that we'll see Nehemiah pray asking God to remember me. Remember me, God. Why? Because I'm doing this for you. Nehemiah wasn't seeking an earthly reward. He was looking forward to God's evaluation. Warren Wiersbe writes about this passage and says, "For people in places of authority, the temptation to increase wealth and power is always present." We see all kinds of examples of that in our own day, in our own world. Jesus said in Luke 22:27, "I am among you as one who serves." And he told his disciples, "Do not lord it over as the Gentile leaders do, but you are a servant as a leader." Now, we got to remind ourselves of that as a husband in a marriage, as a father, a mother in a family. We are there to serve. We're leaders, yes, there's responsibility there, but we do it in a servant leadership. That's how Jesus modeled leadership. Nehemiah was generous to others and asked for no earthly reward. He wasn't asking for even what he could receive as a governor, food to feed himself or his servants, or money or whatever. He was giving. He was generous. He didn't want any reward from them. Nehemiah was generous. To him, the entire 12-year enterprise was a labor of love. He didn't want praise or reward from people. He wanted only the reward that God would give him for his sacrificial service. Now, keep your finger in this passage. We're going to come back. Turn with me to the end of this book. End of Nehemiah. All right? We're going to take a peek at the last verse. Nehemiah 13. Actually, not the last verse, last chapter. Chapter 13, verse 14. Here's another prayer saying, "Remember me." Nehemiah 13:14. "Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for its services." Remember me, O God. Nehemiah has a pure heart, a pure motivation, not to see what he can get and gain for himself here in this world, but he's motivated by God's evaluation, by God's rewards. That's what motivates him. Of course, Nehemiah could not read 1 Corinthians 4, 1 through 5, hadn't been written yet, but he was practicing it. It says, "Let a man," 1 Corinthians 4, 1 through 5, "let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful." Nehemiah was a faithful steward of what God gave him to do. I continue to read. But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by a human court. In fact, I don't even judge myself, for I know of nothing against myself, yet I'm not justified by this. But he who judges me is the Lord. Therefore judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsels of the hearts. Then each one's praise will come from God. We know that God, Jesus Christ, for us as believers, the bride of Christ, is the ultimate judge, the evaluator. And when we stand before him, he will evaluate us and reward us for eternity according to how faithful a steward we have been. This is the kind of principle under which Nehemiah is operating. And this is why he has such a pure motivation. And this is why he has the moral integrity to face down all of these Jewish officials publicly, and they say, okay, you're right, absolutely. That's not according to the law. Everybody else does it, but okay, we won't do it. We'll return it all. We'll straighten it all out. Nehemiah can point to his, whatever part of his 12 years has passed, we don't know. He can say, look what I'm doing here. Look how I'm living. Look how I'm feeding probably you guys. You're at my table every day. I don't charge you. I'm giving. I don't have to do that. I'm giving of my own pocket, generous to help this project, to help this people, to help reestablish this nation and get it to the point where God can bless it and someday bring the Messiah, whatever in his time. And I am all in for this vision, for this project. Get with the program, guys. And they do, because of his integrity. Wow, we can learn a lot about that. He was generous only to please God. Now, let's apply this, what we've learned today. Integrity provides moral authority to lead. We must value integrity above the accomplishment of our vision. Now, you got to say, well, now, Nehemiah, you know, this was a big risk. You took a big chance here. I mean, that could have ruined the project of building on the wall if the nobles had rebelled and tried to get all the people to rebel, or whatever could have happened. Contacted King Artaxerxes and complained, or who knows what trouble they could have stirred up. There are already enough enemies out there, and as we're going to see in the rest of the book, there's too much contact already between the enemies, the Gentile nations, and Jewish people already inside Jerusalem, and that's going to cause problems. And so that could have just all festered and exploded. But see, Nehemiah believed integrity and doing the right thing and obeying God's law and treating people correctly and helping them was more important than even the wall he came to build. He's even willing to risk that in order to do what's right. We've mentioned earlier in the study of Nehemiah, we need today leaders who are willing to say, not the polls say this, not this would be expedient for the political process down the road, not this is what my party wants, not even maybe this is what my constituents are telling me to do. We need leaders who will say this is right and that is wrong. That's Nehemiah. That's a godly leader. And so you might have a vision. You might want to accomplish something, maybe at school, at work, whatever. You know, it's easy to think about. Well, yeah, I want to go on and go to university. I want to get a degree and whatever. So at school, my goal, my vision is to get good grades. I need that to help me with scholarships or whatever. And so then we're tempted to take shortcuts. Well, this guy's pretty smart over here, and he's offering me his answer that he came up with. And so we're tempted to cheat in some way. In business, we're tempted to cut corners and do ethics the way ethics is done today. In order to compete, you got to do this. Rather than saying, you know what, forget that. Maybe we lose the deal, but at least we did the right thing. We were honest. That's the kind of leader Nehemiah is. That's the kind of leader we need today. Even to put the very vision at risk were willing to trust God with that. Nehemiah was willing to trust God with whatever was going to happen, whether he's going to get this wall built or not. But he's going to do the right thing. He's going to have integrity. He is going to do what God's law says. He is going to be the kind of leader that God's principles ask him to be. Oh, we need more men and women and young people like that. Warren Wiersbe says, I quote, "Be sure that your own integrity is intact. A guilty conscience will rob you of the spiritual authority you need to give proper leadership. But every sacrifice you have made will give you the extra strength you need to defeat the enemy." Every great leader must possess an inner conviction and the willingness to bring his or her own life into alignment with that conviction. That's foundational. That's important. It is the alignment between a person's convictions and his behavior that make his life persuasive. To gain and maintain your influence, you must have moral authority. Nothing else can replace it. We all know people who have an IQ way off the charts. They have skills, they have charisma, we say, they have all kinds of contacts. They were born in the right family, they had the right education, they've got everything right, they've got the money, they've got the position, they've got everything that would give them the best chance of being, the most influential person. But they've blown it because they don't have integrity. Someone without any of that, like a Mother Teresa, can have way more influence because they don't understand the importance of integrity, of moral authority. Moral authority, integrity cannot be replaced with anything else. Moral authority is the credibility you earn by people seeing a proper relationship between what you say and do, between what you claim to be and what you are. A lot of people claiming to be one thing, and if you watch them, they really don't turn out to be that. A great leader must be beyond reproach. There must be alignment between conviction and action, belief and behavior. Nothing else can compensate for it. Moral authority makes you a leader worth following. But moral authority is a very fragile thing. It takes a lifetime to earn it. And you can lose it by one choice, one decision. In fact, we can quote our own Warren Buffett here in Omaha as saying something very close to that. Saying it takes a lifetime to earn the kind of respect that he's talking about, and you can lose it in one choice, one decision. 5 minutes, I think is what he said. So, it's fragile. It's something that we need to concentrate on. Let's just stop and say, can you ever re-earn it? You can re-earn integrity, but it takes a lot of effort. Takes a lot of effort. A good instance might be, or a good example might be Zacchaeus in the New Testament. Here's a man who is known as a tax collector. He's working for the enemy, the Roman government, and he swindles people. He's charged them way too much taxes, and he's really improved his own financial standing. And of course, he comes to Jesus. Jesus comes to his house, and Jesus presents himself to it. And Nicodemus' life has changed, and he says, "You know what? Okay, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I shouldn't have done all of that." Well, how many people in the nation of Israel would have listened to Nicodemus coming out of his house saying, "I'm sorry, I blew it"? But Nicodemus went to great effort. Zacchaeus, I'm using the wrong name. Thank you. Zacchaeus comes out and he goes to great effort. He says, "I'm going to give it all back. Not just what I took, but multiple times that. I'm going to take half of my wealth and then give that to the poor." He lists off a whole bunch of things he didn't need to do. Nobody was required to make restitution like this. You suppose after that, maybe people would listen if Zacchaeus says, Jesus changed my life. Really? Show me. Yeah, here's what I did. Oh, okay. So, if we lose our integrity, if we lose our moral authority, it takes great effort, but we can get it back. But better to preserve it. It is a lifetime, it's a lifetime task to build that, and we need to value it so we do preserve it. A good illustration, again, is if I asked you, what do you think about, think is maybe not the right term, what do you feel about your parents? Tell me about your parents. Well, you'll start out giving me just facts, but it won't take very long, and I'll be able to sense whether you hold your parents in high regard and high respect, or whether you don't. And you know what? That's not determined by their status, and how much money they made, and what degrees they made in college, and who they knew, and what they did for a job, and all of that stuff. It isn't affected by how much they left you with. It's affected by their integrity. Because you either look at your parents with respect, maybe you don't agree with them, on everything, but you still respect them because they lived out their convictions. They had integrity. They did what they believed. They didn't tell you, do as I say, not as I do. Or maybe you don't have respect for them because, they didn't live out what they told you they believed or wanted you to believe. That's an illustration of how important integrity is and how influential it is. Our integrity is based upon our submission to God and His Word. Nehemiah was generous because he was committed to a blameless walk before God. He was committed to a mission from God to build that wall. Not so that it would have a certain effect on the people. He was committed to doing what was right regardless of the consequences, even if it negatively affected his vision, what he's trying to accomplish. And so you and I, and by the way, if you're a parent, children will watch. If you're at work and you claim to be a believer, people are going to watch. And if you're at school, they're going to watch. They're going to test your convictions. They're going to offer you a shortcut. They're going to say, well, if you really want to accomplish that, then we need to do this. This is a shortcut. This will work. And they're going to watch what you do, how you react to that. Will you take it? Or will you stand up for what's right, for what you believe is right? Developing and maintaining moral authority requires three things. Number one, character. To do what is right according to God's Word. Now, someone has said character is what you do in the dark when no one else is around. No one watching, no one to impress. Of course, God's there. But that's character. What you will discipline yourself, will you discipline yourself to do what's right or wrong? To be a man or woman of character requires you to surrender to God's standards, values, and principles. That's the only way you and I can be a man or woman of character. To say, you know what? God says this, and that's the way it is, and that's what I'm going to do, no matter where the chips fall, no matter what that affects. Secondly, sacrifice. And we see that in this passage. Nehemiah has character. He will not put a greater burden on the people, even though he deserves, maybe as the governor, certain food and money. He's got great character. He's not going to do things to manipulate, to take their land and all of that. And then he sacrifices. He demonstrates his own commitment to them by feeding them and helping them. Sacrifice is the clearest demonstration of your commitment to what could be. In order to get others to give sacrificially, you must lead the way. If you've got a vision, whether for your marriage or your family or your place at work or your group at school or the local church, if you are not willing to sacrifice to see that happen, guess what? Nobody else is going to be willing either. Because they watch you and they say, well, you don't take it that seriously. I mean, if the going gets really tough, if you've got to sacrifice, you're not willing to do that. Why should we be? Sacrifice demonstrates your commitment. And then thirdly, time. We've referred to this already. Moral authority is not achieved overnight. You can't flip a switch and say, tomorrow I'm going to have moral authority with people. Moral authority is achieved over time. It is developed through a proper response to circumstances. Circumstances over which you have no control. People watch you and they say, well, now what in the world is that person going to do now? Now that they're facing that challenge, which they can't just pay enough money to erase, or they can't give an order and change everything. That's why people watch believers when they have cancer, or tragedy strikes, or they lose a loved one, or there's an accident, or the economy goes bad for them, or whatever. Then they want to see, how does this person respond to these kinds of circumstances? That's where we learn what that person is really like. Will they obey God? Will they obey what their conviction? They tell us to trust God. Are they going to trust God in this setting? Or are they going to be like everybody else? Character, sacrifice, and time to build integrity, moral authority, and how valuable it is. We have learned today from Nehemiah, a good leader must have moral authority, which comes when people see him demonstrate his convictions in his sacrificial actions. Nehemiah had the moral authority to lead the nation of Judah to accomplish what was right, and he could face those leaders, Jewish leaders, and make them change their ways because he had the moral authority, the integrity of how he himself was operating to show them they're wrong. We must have the integrity before God so that we have the moral authority to lead as a good model. Andy Stanley writes and tells a true story of a 24-year-old young lady in a college class. Now, she's a little older than most of the students there, right? And she's in a speech class, and they were asked to give a persuasive speech persuading the class on some subject. And the subjects varied, all kinds of political things and all kinds of things. She chose to speak on the merits of the pro-life position against abortion. Well, that's a very controversial subject, especially in a university classroom. She challenged the class listened with the normal reactions to such a controversial subject. Then she challenged the accepted exceptions of rape and incest and endangerment of the mother's life. She said she didn't even agree with abortion in those extreme cases. Well, at this point, even some of her pro-life classmates became kind of uncomfortable because of there's normally a discussion after the class, and this is going to be quite a heated debate, and wow, she's put herself way out there on the limb, and how are we going to defend all of that? But then as she concluded her speech, she shared how her own world, had been shattered by a rape. The rape resulted in a pregnancy. She then held up and produced a 5x7 picture of a small child of obviously mixed racial makeup and introduced him by name. And she said, "This is my son. He is the joy of my life. I couldn't imagine living life without him." And then she reiterated her position against abortion under any circumstances, and that abortion is always unacceptable. As she sat down, there was only silence. Not the normal natural debate and partisan attacks and all of that. An audience can disagree with a position, but they cannot disagree with the reality of conviction lived out. Oh, that each one of us, as a believer, only as a testimony for God in the school and in the neighborhood and at work and everywhere we are, all that we as a believer would have enough integrity and moral authority that no one could argue with our personal testimony of how God had changed our life. If we'd be like a Zacchaeus or like this young lady. Oh, that each of us would be the kind of a leader in our sphere of influence that God could use to make an eternal difference because of our integrity and moral authority. You are a leader. Someone looks to you. Someone watches. You demonstrate what you believe. Some of you are in a marriage. Some of you are in a home, parents. Some of you are at work. Some of you are at school. Somewhere, God wants to use you to influence other people. Your influence is directly linked to your integrity, to your moral authority. And that should be protected at all costs. Why? Because it honors God. Father, thank you for this story of Nehemiah. Thank you for him being such a model of integrity that even his servants would change the normal methods of being governor's servants and what they do and how they relate to people. Thank you that he could face and confront these Jewish leaders, and that because of his moral authority and integrity, they would back down and they would change and they would return all of the money that they had gotten from these poor people and so on. Father, we need to be lights and salt in our world. We need to be towers of integrity, of moral authority. No matter what the issue might be, we will stand for the right. We will stand for God. We will serve Him. No matter if we are seemingly in this culture going one way, the wrong way on a one-way street. If we know that this is God's word, this is your will, then we will do that. And Father, help us to value that. Help us to understand how important that is for us to be able to influence others and for you to use us, for us to be committed, to be a faithful steward, faithful to you. Father, some of us have lost that in various ways in our lives, and we need to straighten that out. We need to perhaps apologize to people, ask for forgiveness, correct things, go out of our way to show that from here on out, we are going to follow the right. We are going to be the godly person we need to be. Help us to, though it takes work, to regain that. Help us to be the parents and the mates and the workers and students and all of that we need to be with integrity. And so, Father, help us to learn from Nehemiah how important that was and how greatly you used it. In Jesus' name, amen.